Hello there, welcome to SoulProdMusic Gaming, where we always take the high ground, and it is once again spooky season. Yes, Halloween is upon us, and that means once again I need to give you something suitably creepy with one of my retro reviews. And of course, the most obvious solution is always the best, and I am going back to the Resident Evil franchise. So hide behind your pillows and hold your Mario stuffy tight, because I am doing a retro review of Resident Evil 5. Before we go any further, be advised, this retro review does include some serious spoilers for the storyline, so if you do not want those, please stop watching now. You're still here? Brilliant. Why don't you hit that like button, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and let's get to it. Released in March 2009, Resident Evil 5 came out on both the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Interestingly enough, this wasn't actually the fifth in the main line Resident Evil games. Depending on your opinion, it's either 7th or 8th. We had Resident Evil 0 as a prequel, Code Veronica X, and of course, we also had the 2002 remake of Resident Evil. Either way, this game was much more a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4 than any of the other games. And that's because, like Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5 abandons many of the gameplay mechanics seen in the earlier games, including the typewriter as a save and the storage boxes to put your items in. It also doesn't have one big open gameplay, instead split into individual chapters and levels, with no option to go back to areas once you've left them. Whilst this does in some way take away from the survival horror element, it still does allow for good gameplay, and there are other aspects of the game, such as the puzzles and of course creepy monsters, that the game certainly maintains. The game continues to be far more action-based than earlier games in the franchise, and in many ways ups this significantly from Resident Evil 4. The game maintains the quick-time events we saw in Resident Evil 4, but also adds a lot more in the way of gameplay variety, with whole levels played out with our characters riding in the backs of jeeps, and the focus being entirely on shooting. None of these points are pros or cons, however, it just depends what you're looking for in a Resident Evil game. There's a lot more action and a fair bit less survival horror, but again, depending on your interest, this could still be right up your street. Like we saw in Resident Evil 4, this gameplay can still be very creepy and horror-esque. However, there are a number of elements within this game that do take it away a little bit more from that. The fact that this game is set very often in broad daylight, set in areas of Africa, is a massive change of pace. However, it's still got a fair bit of creepy horror elements to it. The game focuses on our main two characters. From the previous games, we see the return of Chris Redfield, last seen in Resident Evil Code Veronica X, and previously in the original Resident Evil. Although this time around he is looking substantially more buff, which again really fits into the narrative and feel of this being far more of an action game. He kinda has the look of an 80s action hero, rather than a character you'd expect to see, again, in a horror movie trying to survive. The game also introduces a new character, Sheva Olamar. She is a West African member of the BSAA, the counter-bioterrorist group that Chris is working for, and she is acting as a new replacement partner for him following the shock horror death of Jill Valentine. As a secondary character, Sheva is not always super reliable, and this is more due to the gameplay mechanics. She's not always where you want her to be or doing what you want her to do. However, storyline wise, she's really good, and in many ways it's a shame we haven't seen her back really since this game. Resident Evil 5 is very heavily story and action focused, and the story engages you right from the get-go with some really impressive cutscenes all the way through that really immerse you. It's very cinematic. The action is intense, but again, it doesn't necessarily feel too horror focused in many areas. That doesn't mean though that it doesn't come with a few frights and jump scares. The game is also the first time we would see a two-player game mode in a Resident Evil game, and this is really an element that the game is especially successful and famous for. When played as a two-player, the game takes on a whole new lease of life. You can swap and exchange resources, you can plan your attacks and coordinate your tactics, and given how much the game focuses on action, this really gives it a lot more depth and quality. But with all that said, how was this game received when it was released back in 2009? Well, strap in because this one gets a little bit long and complicated. First of all, scores ranged dramatically for this game, from between around 70% to 95%. And before you make the assumption, those ranging differences did not seem to be between the two different console releases. So let's start with the positives and see what people really liked about this game. Well, Corey Cohen of Official Xbox Magazine described the graphics as gorgeous and praised the game's high-paced gameplay. This was added to by comments by writers for Game Informer, who said not only were the graphics outstanding and the best they'd seen in one of these games to date, but they also praised the sound and voice acting in the game. Meanwhile, writers from GameZone and IGN focused on the game's replay value and longevity. One writer even stated it was worthy of 2 complete playthroughs in one weekend. However, alongside all this praise, there was some criticism. Writers from Game Revolution described it as a full-on action blockbuster, which sounds like praise and in many ways was. However, they point out that by midway through the game, it gives up any pretense in attempting to be a survival horror game anymore, which of course is what Resident Evil was famous for. As Kristen Reed of Eurogamer pointed out, survival horror is what the game franchise's core audience wanted. So by losing elements of this, they were potentially losing elements of their fans' own interest and goodwill. The AI used to control Sheva also came under criticism, with people pointing out that she had a tendency to recklessly expend ammunition and health supplies. However, all of these criticisms would pale in comparison to one particular response to the initial trailer. Following the 2007 E3 trailer release, there were allegations from Newsweek that it featured classic racial imagery and accused the game of racism. Whilst many of these allegations came from only the brief snippets that were seen in that first trailer, it didn't stop further allegations being made without looking at the game in its full context. Eventually, Sue Clark of the BBFC spoke out that the game had been reviewed, and whilst they take all matters of racism very seriously, there was none within Resident Evil 5. Unfortunately, the controversy did not harm the game's sales, which were fantastic across both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The game was also nominated for a number of awards around acting, specifically from the actress who played and voiced Sheva, but overall sound and visual design. Interestingly enough, to make the point, it was also nominated for Action Adventure Game of the Year, which really just confirmed how the game was seen. But how does the game stand up now? How does it hold up to modern scrutiny? This is probably the one time I am most perfectly poised to answer this question. I played the game back when it was first released on the Xbox 360, and whilst I enjoyed it to a degree, it was certainly not one of my favourite Resident Evil games in any way. I played it as a one-player and also as a two-player with one of my friends. I enjoyed the two-player version of the game far more, but I never really saw it as a real Resident Evil game. It was just a big old shoot-'em-up. A good one, by the way, and a good game, but not necessarily a good Resident Evil game. And overall, I kind of developed a relative disdain for the game as part of the Resident Evil franchise. However, many of you will know that I recently replayed the game again as a 2-player alongside my good friend the Gaming Lord 04, who, by the way, it's his channel that all of this footage is sourced from, and our gameplay. And I have to say, I really enjoyed the game. Yes, it still isn't really the survival horror that Resident Evil once was. However, I've come to accept that the franchise evolved. The best movies do this. They can't necessarily stick with doing the exact same thing. So instead the gameplay moved along, and it's done it very well. I can't quite say why I didn't have the same issues with Resident Evil 4 that I did here. Maybe it just took that final step away from feeling like it had anything to do with the original franchise. Maybe it was because I was less invested with the character of Chris than I was with Leon. However, on this replay, I found that the graphics and gameplay stand up 100%, and if it was released like this today, I would not think twice about playing the game. The variety in the scenes, combat and gameplay actually feels like much more of a strength to me now, and the story of the actual game is phenomenal. The fact that we are trying to uncover the mystery behind Jill's death and the eventual reveal that she's still alive and working for Wesker, again, not necessarily under her own control, is a fantastic plot twist. The chapter element carried over from Resident Evil 4 wasn't necessarily my favourite. However, now that I'm streaming games, it works way better for this, even if it takes away from that survival horror element of the game. The ability to upgrade your weapons and use treasures to buy additional weapons in between levels kind of again really kills any survival horror element. But it actually makes the game way more fun to play, so maybe sometimes we have to sacrifice what we wanted for what we get. When Resident Evil 5 first came out, I, of course, judged it by the Resident Evil games, a franchise I'd been playing for a while at this point and had fallen in love with. Resident Evil 5 isn't really that type of game, but that doesn't mean it's a bad one. It took what was in Resident Evil 4 and then continued to progress down the action gameplay route and does it to a really good level. Knowing what I knew and going back to play it again, I think it's fair to give this game an 8 out of 10. Whilst it wasn't what I wanted it to be back then, knowing that that's what I was walking into, playing it again, I've had lots of fun doing so. I've really come to like the character of Sheva as well, and developed a bit of a new love for Chris Redfield too. Want to give a quick shout out and thank you to the Gaming Lord 04 for playing through this game with me over on his channel. Please go and check out that playthrough, it was lots of fun, and thank you for him letting me use the content for this video. What are your thoughts? Have you played this game yourself? Was I too kind or too harsh? Comment below, let me know. And of course, have a fantastic Halloween. Until next time, take the high ground.